So, welcome to this edition of On the Pulse, in which CMS experts provide updates on the key developments bringing innovation and disruption to the life sciences and healthcare sector. I'm your host, Nick Beckett. Today, we're delving into the fertile area of cannabis, and I'm delighted to be joined by three of the CMS life sciences specialists who regularly advise clients in this sector. So we've got Shuna Mason from the UK, we've got Gielen from the Netherlands, and Opilio from Italy. So welcome to all of you. So there's been a real buzz, I think, on cannabis over the recent years. Cannabis obviously has a very wide range of both medical and industrial application. And I think the European cannabis report a couple of years ago suggested the value of the EU market could be 55 billion euros within the next 10 years. And with a population of somewhere in the order of 750 million people, it's anticipated that Europe could be the biggest market for cannabis kind of on the planet. I think when you look at it from a regulatory perspective, I've read an article that suggested it's following Moore's law, that in the last few years, every 2 years, the number of countries opening up their laws to allow for medical use of cannabis is doubling. CMS has put out a report, a legal roadmap for cannabis on this. And obviously that's a fascinating read of itself. And obviously there are differences between all the different markets. But if I just look at the table in the report, as a summary, I would say that with some exceptions, such as Bulgaria or Russia, it is in general medically allowed. Medical use is allowed of cannabis in the majority of markets in Europe. But I think what's interesting is that actually when you look at the markets themselves and what's actually happening, the position is very different. So maybe it'd be good just to begin with an overview from each of you on what's happening in each of your markets. So maybe start with Laura, if you could tell us what's happening in Italy on the market.
Thank you, Nick. In Italy, the situation is rapidly evolving. We just have one authorized industrial drug on the market, which has been authorized in 2013, even if other drugs which are marketed in foreign countries can be imported upon request of a single hospital or doctor for named patients. Nevertheless, since 2006, Italian doctors are allowed to prescribe cannabis to patients affected by very serious diseases like multiple sclerosis or spinal cord injuries, or patients affected by cancer who are treated by chemotherapy in order to reduce the adverse effects of chemotherapy like nausea or vomiting. And also patients affected by AIDS can be treated with cannabis drugs. Cannabis is usually taken by decoction or inhalation by special vaporizers, and the applications are prepared by chemists in the premises of a pharmacy. So it's not allowed to prepare the drug at home. There is a growing request for cannabis treatments by Italian patients, and the Ministry of Health has endorsed the use of cannabis for these diseases and also allowed the reimbursement by the Italian government for patients who are admitted to cannabis. In principle, it is also possible to use cannabis for the so-called other uses, which means anxiety, depression, or other kind of diseases for which the reimbursement by the Italian healthcare system is not allowed. Of course, the cost of cannabis is an issue for the Italian government. In Italy, we do not produce cannabis. Private companies are not allowed to start the production of cannabis. The Italian government, in order to reduce the cost of the importation from the Netherlands, started some years ago experimental plant under the control of the military chemical plant based in Florence. So we started to have public production under the control of the state, which is highly insufficient to meet the expectations of the Italian market. The production will be probably doubled in 2020, but nevertheless, we still buy cannabis from abroad. Some years ago, the Italian government started to buy cannabis through public tender procedures. The last public tender was awarded to a Canadian company, but still the production at the national level by private companies is not allowed. So also Italian growers are not allowed to participate in public tenders. The consumption of cannabis for medical purposes has increased 10 times from 2014 to 2018. So the potentiality of this market is very, very high. And we expect that in the future, the situation will change and more producers will be allowed to enter into the Italian market.
And Shuna, for the UK, is the situation similar to Italy?
There are certainly similarities. So in the UK, it became possible for cannabis to be prescribed legally from the 1st of November 2018. So that was a big step change for the UK. But prescribing is limited to specialist doctors who've actually got to be entered on a specialist register kept by the General Medical Council. And in practice, there have in fact been very few prescriptions, so not really significantly over 100 since legalisation there in November 2018. And most of those have really been in the private medical sector in the UK rather than in the National Health Service. So a lot of prescribing is in relation to unauthorised medical cannabis. And for that to take place, the guidance that's come out from the regulatory bodies for healthcare professionals is that that kind of prescribing should be agreed by a multidisciplinary team of specialist doctors. And certainly at the basic primary care level, general practitioners are not able to prescribe unauthorised medical cannabis to patients. And also there's no form of over-the-counter or OTC medical cannabis available in the UK. There are some authorised products, but really the range of uses for those is fairly limited. And National Health Service, NHS reimbursement isn't mandated for that. So that means, therefore, that the cost will fall on the patient or on their family. And so in practice, there are quite restrictive conditions of use and fairly low-level prescribing within the NHS. And so we see many patients just using private clinics where, as I mentioned, prescribing is also still relatively low level. And of course, one reads reports of patients therefore obtaining cannabis on the black market, which of course is not subject to adequate quality control. And there are quite significant variations therefore in the quality of products that people are consuming. There have been some criminal prosecutions initiated against patients in the UK where they cultivated cannabis for their own medicinal use, or else alternatively they've sourced it in various forms via the black market. And we have also seen some enforcement by the UK Home Office against CBD products in the over-the-counter wellness sector, so CBD oils, where retailers have been challenged to demonstrate that these CBD products are actually lawful. We've also heard of some enforcement against suppliers of unauthorised medicinal cannabis, where they're supplying it as a UK special. And although the courts tend to take a fairly sympathetic approach when they're dealing with patients such as MS patients who've been using this to sort of deal with severe spasticity symptoms, these cases are extremely fact sensitive, and they certainly don't set a legal precedent in terms of the way courts are going to respond to these cases. But we do see signs of a sympathetic approach, not only by the courts, but also by prosecutors.
And Ellen, obviously the general stereotype is the Dutch have a very permissive approach with cannabis, but what's the situation for medicinal use?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Well, also in the Netherlands, doctors are quite reserved when it comes to prescribing medicinal cannabis to patients. So that doesn't differ very much from the situation in the UK. And however, the possibility to prescribe cannabis already exists in the Netherlands for a very, very long time, actually since 2003. But it is still not considered rational pharmacotherapy. So all doctors' guidance documents do not encourage prescribing medicinal cannabis due to the lack of scientific evidence that medicinal cannabis is effective. And treatment in the Netherlands with medicinal cannabis is only eligible if the usual treatments and registered medicines do not sufficiently help patients or, cause too many side effects. However, doctors are allowed to prescribe cannabis that's not limited to certain diseases. It's up to the doctor to decide whether a patient would benefit from a treatment with medicinal cannabis. But in practice, what you see in the Netherlands is that prescriptions are often not issued as a treatment, but merely to relieve certain pain symptoms in limited situations. And if a prescription is issued, the patient generally does not get reimbursement from the health insurer. So the patients have to pay for the cannabis themselves. The absence of clinical studies and study results is the main reason that cannabis is not reimbursed by most of the health insurers in the Netherlands. With respect to the pharmacists, community pharmacies in the Netherlands have provided medicinal cannabis 5% less often in 2019 in comparison to the year before. So the number of prescriptions has fallen below 50,000 for the first time since 2017. There is, however, a major increase in the popularity of various freely available products containing CBD. Shuna already mentioned those products. Contrary to THC containing medicinal cannabis, many CBD products are available without prescription. For instance, on the internet, at drugstores, or in health food stores, and these products and oils are sometimes offered as a food supplement and sometimes as a medical device. And there is a huge market for that in the Netherlands. Although the use of medicinal cannabis in the Netherlands is not that high, the Netherlands is a very large exporter of medicinal cannabis. Laura already mentioned that Italy is one of the main importers of medicinal cannabis growth in the Netherlands. And in order to meet this growing foreign demand of medicinal cannabis and the need for new cannabis varieties on the Dutch market itself, a public procurement procedure is currently being conducted in the Netherlands by the Dutch Office of Medicinal Cannabis. And this office will contract with a grower who obtains a permit and will be allowed to grow the medicinal cannabis in the Netherlands. The office has the exclusive right to import, to export, to wholesale, and to hold stocks regarding cannabis. And therefore, there is no possibility for growers without a license to be active on the Dutch market. And as a consequence, all harvests will be purchased by the Office of Medicinal Cannabis. And although this is a very interesting procurement procedure, at the moment the outcome of the procurement procedure is still unknown. It's actually a little bit into the dark what will happen, but it's an interesting development, and we will keep you posted on this in the near future.
Well, what's really interesting then to me is, obviously from a legal and regulatory perspective, then medical cannabis is allowed. I'm hearing that it's been available, in market for 15 to almost 20 years in many cases. And there's obviously a great need, in many therapeutic areas, many serious ones, including chronic pain. But again, what I'm hearing that despite that, it's not at this point widely used in the market. And, the question arises, well, why is that, Shuna?
So I think it comes down to, from a UK perspective, down to a general lack of hard scientific evidence, and that's especially in the form of so-called gold standard randomized clinical trial data. And that's certainly the UK view, where it comes, for example, for use of medical cannabis for management of chronic pain. The perception is that there's a continued current lack of evidence supporting the use of medical cannabis for managing that condition. And that's really despite the fact that cannabis-based medicines do appear to have been available in other countries for a number of years. When you look at what the various professional bodies for specialist medical practitioners are saying in the UK, broadly they're supportive of the use of medical cannabis, but only after conventional interventions have failed, or, and this is important, I think, within the context of high quality clinical research, in other words, clinical trials, in order to analyse the potential benefits of medical cannabis for relief of pain. There's also been some concern voiced about prescribing of medical cannabis by isolated cannabis clinics, as to whether such clinics are actually carrying out an appropriately comprehensive and multidisciplinary patient assessment before they actually prescribe. And that would obviously include considering the possibility of using alternative therapies to medicinal cannabis. So in the UK, I think there are also concerns that the potential benefits offered by medical cannabis are comparatively modest and not necessarily cost effective, and therefore, particularly in the public sector, don't make for effective use of what are limited National Health Service, NHS, resources. And that's despite the fact that there are thought to be significant numbers of people who are using non-medicinal, in other words, recreational cannabis for self-administration for treating various conditions, including pain. For example, to give symptomatic relief where they've got some underlying debilitating chronic medical condition where a chronic pain is involved, because obviously use of recreational cannabis brings its own risks because of the variation in quality of those products. If you look at the type of guidance that's coming out from NICE, which is England's health technology body, and they're responsible for assessing new drugs and treatments when these become available. In November 2019, they published guidance that says that medical cannabis shouldn't be prescribed for managing chronic pain, except for cannabidiol, or CBD, which, if you remember, is that pure plant-derived cannabinoid. And that should be used on its own, but only in the context of a clinical trial. So again, the emphasis is all on generating scientific evidence. So NICE considered that the evidence available did show that CBD reduced chronic pain, but that the treatment effect was modest, and there wasn't any evidence of any corresponding reduction in opioid use in people who were prescribed medicinal cannabis for pain. And so because the number of people who are actually suffering chronic pain who might benefit is obviously very large, the cost is potentially high for the National Health Service. So NICE's modelling actually specifically compared the potential possible benefits with the expected costs. And their conclusion was that medical cannabis can't be considered a cost-effective use of NHS resource when it comes to treatment for chronic pain. And although they did recommend research into CBD for adults with fibromyalgia or treatment-resistant neuropathic pain, and that patient population amounts to about 15% of the total UK patient population, which is obviously quite significant. They've recommended the research to check whether it might mean that patients will be able to avoid side effects from existing pain relief medication. So it's not really a question of medical cannabis being used on its own as a first-line treatment necessarily. When it comes to palliative care, again, the perception is that the evidence supporting use of medical cannabis for palliative care patients, so late-stage cancer patients, for example, that was also considered to be insufficient by NICE. And it's not therefore currently recommended for routine clinical practice, though again, NICE has recommended research to look at the benefits of cannabis for palliative care, and that's really to investigate whether it could be made available via outpatient as opposed to inpatient care, or whether it could help reduce overall opioid use. So they're really looking at it from a cost effectiveness perspective and also a public health perspective.
Okay, so Laura, what about the opinion of the Italian authorities on this?
The reasons why medical cannabis is not extended to other diseases are similar to those already mentioned by Shuna. There is a general skepticism about the use of cannabis for diseases which are not those already approved for the medical cannabis treatment by the Italian Ministry of Health. So, for instance, chronic pain or sleep disorders are not considered diseases for which cannabis can be prescribed and reimbursed by the Italian government. In general, the medical cannabis is not considered a proper therapy, is considered just a treatment for symptoms of very serious diseases and for those approved. So also the research in Italy is mainly aimed at assessing the efficacy of the medical cannabis treatment more than at exploring further possibilities to apply cannabis treatments to new or different diseases. In general, cannabis is prescribed only when the standard drugs have proved to be unsuccessful. And in this sense, the situation is similar to the UK situation. In general, there is a skepticism from the scientific community because the evidence of the efficacy of cannabis treatments is not considered sufficiently proved and the evidence is not considered fully reliable. So the research is mainly aimed at assessing the efficacy of the treatment for the purposes already authorized.
So it seems, I mean, that we're still at a relatively early stage then. As Shuna said, there's a lack of hard scientific evidence. There's a lack of experience, I think, of the healthcare professionals who are adopting a relatively conservative approach here. And there are concerns or doubts, or at the very least, a lack of knowledge about the perceived benefits of cannabis for medical use. But there still seems to be a strong interest here, a desire to know more. So, what's actually being done about that? Ellen, maybe?
Yes. Well, the Netherlands has a very special approach, which is actually not intended to get a broader access to cannabis, but it will have that effect. A new experiment will be introduced in the Netherlands during this year in 2020. And the experiment is called the Controlled Cannabis Supply Chain Experiment. And this experiment concerns recreational cannabis. And it is set up to explore if and how growers can supply coffee shops in the Netherlands with quality controlled cannabis in a decriminalized manner. Production and supply of cannabis to coffee shops is illegal, while at the same time selling by the coffee shops to consumers is tolerated by the Dutch government. And by adjusting the regulatory framework, by decriminalizing cultivation, distribution, and sale of cannabis and making these activities subject to a permit, this should improve the quality of the product, protect the public health, and reduce crime. So far, 10 municipalities in the Netherlands will participate in this experiment. And one of the expected side effects is that the recreational branch of cannabis use in the Netherlands will substitute a part of the medicinally prescribed cannabis because of the fact that doctors are holding back from prescribing cannabis and that health insurance companies in general do not reimburse medicinal cannabis. Some patients choose to get their cannabis at the coffee shops. And especially now that the government is planning to supervise the supply and quality through the experiment, expectations are that medicinal users will switch to the freely available recreational cannabis. And they have to pay for it anyway, so you can also get it from the coffee shops. So that's what's currently happening in the Netherlands.
Thanks, Helen. And Shuna, what about the UK? What studies are being conducted there currently?
So in the UK, the focus, as I mentioned, is all really around the generation of hard scientific evidence. So at a national level, the UK's National Institute for Health Research, NIHR, they issued calls for primary clinical research proposals back in 2019. And that was in order to increase knowledge in the area of medical cannabis. And at the moment, they're in the process of considering the applications for research support that they received. NICE also, as I mentioned already, issued a range of recommendations for clinical research across a number of different areas. There's also a UK-wide paediatric network for healthcare professionals, which is being established. And that's really to support knowledge sharing from clinical practice, to discuss complex cases, for example, and to assist in evidence generation. So developing hypotheses or forming networks to actually carry out robust research. There will also be trials for patients who are already using medical cannabis, as well as for cannabis naive patients with relevant conditions. In the meantime, we're also aware that private companies who have pipeline products for which they're looking for marketing authorization are also preparing or have initiated clinical trials into promising candidates in the UK and also elsewhere in the EU. And we've seen several multi-country trials already set up. There's also work afoot to scope and develop a national UK patient registry, so a clinical registry, to collect a uniform data set across all indications, and also some exploratory work to actually see if they can update the National Genomic Test Directory so that whole genome sequencing could actually be offered to children with treatment-resistant epilepsy, where they're under consideration for treatment with medical cannabis. There's another similar private sector initiative by Drug Science, which is a UK charity, which has established what it refers to as Europe's first and biggest medical cannabis registry, and that's called Project 2021. And their aim is to enrol 20,000 patients suffering from a variety of specified conditions by the end of 2021. And again, the goal is obviously to create a large body of evidence supporting efficacy and tolerability of medical cannabis that can be relied upon and support both policymakers, but also prescribers of the benefits of wider adoption of medical cannabis for patients. And clinics enrolling patients in those registries will only be able to do so if patients have already attempted 2 different licensed medications which have been found to be ineffective. So again, you're not seeing it moving into first-line treatment, but you're seeing research initiatives or data collection initiatives being established.
So we can expect lots of research then to come to try to, persuade healthcare professionals and payers and the authorities of the safety and the efficacy of medicinal cannabis. And in the meantime, then it sounds as if other avenues may be found to try to meet the very significant demand from patients for the product. So that could come in the form of coffee shops in the Netherlands, a diversion of recreational channels perhaps, or perhaps from private companies looking to exploit what's evidently a pretty significant market. So looking to the future, I guess the question I'd ask all of you is, what does that hold? What are we likely to see in the coming years in this market? So maybe Laura, start with you.
Yes, I can foresee that in Italy the situation will change in the next years, in the sense that the Italian government is trying to cut the cost of importing cannabis from abroad. So probably private growers will be authorized to produce medical cannabis in Italy, and investors could be interested in entering into this market. There is a high pressure from the Italian Growers Association to be authorized to produce cannabis. Italy was one of the main producers of cannabis last century, so there are the conditions to produce cannabis here in Italy. And of course, Italian growers do not understand why we have to buy cannabis from abroad and at the same time not authorize an Italian production. So there is a pressure in this sense, and I believe that Italian companies, or of course companies interested in entering this market and getting a share of this market in Italy will be authorized in the future. At the same time, the public procurement tenders, which are new because Italy only bought through the Dutch channel up to some years ago, is an interesting opportunity for foreign companies to get a share of the Italian market. There is an internal growing request for cannabis, and this, of course, make Italy a big potential market for medical cannabis products. So, of course, the results of the scientific research will be very important in order to speed up the process and to allow a wider use of medical cannabis in the market.
And Shuna, what does the future hold in the UK, do you think?
Well, as far as growing and cultivation of cannabis is concerned, that's already allowed, but subject to Home Office regulation in the UK. I know one of the barriers that was identified to the uptake of cannabis used medicinally was a lack or a difficulty with importing product. And there is therefore some work being undertaken to actually see if they can promote in-country cultivation and manufacturing. Not sure whether the weather is sufficiently reliable to really permit that, but certainly they're looking at in a UK manufacturing. I think in terms of broader future developments, I think maybe two things spring to mind. So firstly, I think generation of robust clinical data will definitely remain a focus through clinical trials, clinical registries, and also really through shared prescribing experience like that clinical network that I mentioned to you. Because without that, I think there's going to be a lot of difficulty persuading payers, commissioners of healthcare, to agree to fund these treatments, and in particular in the National Health Service, where there is understandably watchfulness to try and avoid a repeat of opioid overprescribing, which we've seen over the last 20 years. The UK has already seen some private clinics established, and they've got specific licenses to enable them to prescribe medicinal cannabis. But without reimbursement, obviously that financial burden is just going to fall upon patients and their families, and that can be significant. If these products are really to become widely available, widely prescribed in the UK, I think there will obviously need to be increased reimbursement available. And really it's a question of producing hard evidence, both as to clinical benefits, but also the cost effectiveness of their use. The second point, I think that we can expect to see ongoing enforcement by the MHRA and also by companies with authorised products, who I would expect would act to actually sort of restrict market access for unauthorised medicinal cannabis, as obviously unauthorised products can only be supplied by the so-called specials route, where the prescriber takes personal responsibility for treatment for an individual named patient on account of that patient's special clinical needs, and where there's no suitable authorised product available. I think it's predictable as more medicinal cannabis products actually get licensed by the MHRA, the scope for prescribing of unauthorised specials will diminish, because obviously healthcare professionals will not be looking to take on personal legal responsibility more than they have to. And the MHRA and licensed companies as well will police, officially and unofficially, the market to prevent special supplies where these overlap with the license indications of authorised products.
And Ellen, what about the Netherlands? What's the future have in for us there?
Yeah, when I look to the future, I think the following will happen in the Netherlands. So far, there's only one industrial medicine based on cannabis authorized in the Netherlands. However, I expect that a lot more products that are based on cannabis and that have been through full clinical trials and that are licensed as a medicine with the marketing authorization in place will be introduced onto the Dutch market in the near future. So instead of drinking tea or smoking, one can take a tablet. So that's certainly one of the things I expect in the near future. Furthermore, I expect that CBD is going to be processed in a wide variety of products, for example, in cosmetics, in drinks, in cigarettes, and so on. We already advised a lot of companies in this respect. And in addition, I already mentioned it, the use of recreational cannabis will substitute part of the medicinal prescribed cannabis in the Netherlands. But just to make it clear, like the UK and Italy, the Netherlands is really focusing on clinical research that will show the effectiveness of cannabis, that will be of real importance to get it reimbursed and also prescribed, of course, by the doctors. And finally, I expect that the highly regulated market on medicinal cannabis in the Netherlands will be slightly more accessible, or as you can say, liberalized, so that more and more growers and other parties involved in the distribution and sale of cannabis get the opportunity to trade cannabis. I think that's what the near future is about in the Netherlands.
So lots of research to come. I think quite interesting, a lot of collaboration, a lot of sharing of data, patient registries like Project 2021 that Shuna mentioned. So that will be interesting. But I think in the meantime, it's such a significant market. There's so much interest in the private sector that, you're going to see some working to increase production capacity, as Laura said, in Italy. And interestingly, as Ellen, you said, links to other sectors, so dietary supplements and cosmetics and drinks and cigarettes even. So hashtag interesting times ahead for the cannabis industry. Okay, so thank you for joining us for this edition of On the Pulse. We hope you found the discussions to be thought-provoking and insightful. If you'd like to discuss any of the topics covered, please do get in touch. To find out more about On the Pulse and CMS's Global Life Sciences and Healthcare Group, visit cms.law. Audio versions of On the Pulse are available through your usual podcast store.